Alright guys, so this is our first kind of video that I want you to see on George Orwell, our opening. Okay, so here's a picture of him. This is his famous quote, "Liberty is telling people what they do not want to hear." Okay, and this is from McGraw-Hill, the little packet I gave you guys. In the years since the publication of Animal Farm in 1984, both of which conjure visions of modern government's dangerous power, critics have studied and analyzed George Orwell's personal life. Orwell was a man who had a reputation for standing apart and even making a virtue of his detachment. This outsider position often led him to oppose the crowd. So he's a very interesting guy. He was born under a different name. George Orwell is his pen name. His real name is Eric Arthur Blair. And here it goes on to say that he chose that name because it sounded very English, George Orwell. Um, and he decided to, enjoy writing as a young child. And his parents sent him at age 8 to a boarding school in England. And then later on, instead of going to university or college, he decided to take a job in Burma with the Indian Imperial Police. That was interesting. Orwell wrote about his experience in Burmese days in 1934 and in the essay Shooting an Elephant. At odds with the British colonial rule, Orwell said he theoretically and secretly, of course, was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. Returning to England to recover from a bout of the chronic lung disease that plagued him all of his life, and that lung disease was tuberculosis, and we know a lot of people who suffered from that in literature. Orwell began his writing career in earnest. Over the next 2 decades, he wrote newspaper columns, novels, essays, and radio broadcasts, most of which grew out of his own personal experience. Um, Orwell's beliefs about politics were affected by his experiences fighting in the Spanish Civil War. He viewed socialists, communists, and fascists as repressive and self-serving. Orwell patriotically supported England during World War II, but remained skeptical of governments and their willingness to forsake ideals in favor of power. With each book or essay, Orwell solidified his role as the outsider willing to question any group's ideology. Orwell spoke his mind with Animal Farm, in which he criticized the Soviet Union despite its role as a World War II ally of Great Britain. At first, no one would even publish the novel, but when Animal Farm finally appeared in 1945, it was a success. It was later adapted both as an animated film and as a play. In explaining how he came to write Animal Farm, Orwell says he once saw a little boy whipping a horse. He gives a little quote there, and he says that bothered him. Orwell said it was the first book in which he consciously tried to blend artistic and political goals. And then later on, he wrote 1984. And then he goes on to say that writing is very difficult. It's laborious. Okay. On the publication of Animal Farm in 45, George Orwell discovered with horror that his booksellers were placing his novel on children's shelves. So here we find out that he did not write this book for children. It does have intended political philosophy and a statement on it in a very satirical way. Animal Farm tells the story of Farmer Jones' animals who rise up in rebellion and take over the farm. Tired of being exploited solely for human gain, the animals, who have human characteristics such as power of speech, vow to create a new and more just society. So the novella, it's small, reads as a satire, and it's not meant for children. There is death and rebellion and war and violence. But on the surface, when we're talking about that two-layered iceberg for an allegory, that top surface is just the story itself, and the underneath is where you're going to get those statements on politics and the historical context and the allegory and what these characters represent. So here's a little bit about allegory. You can go on to read that on your own. And here is a little bit more about Orwell in this little box here. So let's read that. Orwell initially struggled to find a publisher for Animal Farm. Many liberal intellectuals in Europe admired the Soviet experiment with socialism. They believed socialism would produce a society in which everyone, workers and employers, was equal and in which there were no upper, middle, or lower classes. In Orwell's words, they wanted to believe that somewhere a really socialist country does actually exist. Also, British publishers were hesitant to publicly criticized their Soviet allies as World War II came to a close. The book was published in 1945 after Germany surrendered. Orwell believed that the basis for society was human decency and common sense, which conflicted with the ideals of society that were prevalent at the time: socialism, capitalism, communism, and fascism, to name a few. As an individualist who believed that his own experiences should guide his philosophy, he was often at odds with these popular ideas. He believed that governments were encroaching on the individual's freedom of choice, love of family, and tolerance for others. He emphasized honesty, individuality, and the welfare of society throughout his writings. He died not too soon after 1945. He died in 1950, finally, of tuberculosis. So a lot of people have speculated over what his true political views were. Some say that he was a capitalist. Some say that he was a socialist. Some say that he was just an anarchist in total disbelief of any sort of government, especially with the writing of 1984, which shows the Big Brother idea, which is actually a term he coined. So it's interesting when we begin to read Animal Farm to think of what his true ideas and beliefs were as far as government, and does any government work effectively. So that's a little bit about George Orwell. There he is again, and I hope to speak to you more about him tomorrow.